In a recent video about Pepperidge Farm Star Wars cookies from 1983, I showed how I was able to use 3D printing to recreate the mold for the Jabba the Hutt cookie. This made it possible for me to eat some of these cookies, sort of, more than 30 years after they disappeared from store shelves. While this worked pretty well, all things considered, I really wanted to make a cute Jabba cookie cutter that would be more practical for people to print and use. Initially, I tried making a version based on my own artwork, and used a method that was similar to what I did before. I drew it by hand, traced it, and then cleaned up the lines in Adobe Illustrator before converting it to a 3D model. The eyes in particular turned out to be too complex, so I would always get dough stuck in them, but after a few iterations I came up with a cutter that worked pretty well. But I still wasn't satisfied with the design of Jabba. Then I remembered that I had some plastic cups made by Hallmark with cartoony Star Wars characters on them. I figured this Jabba might actually make a really nice cookie cutter. First, I found a full version of the artwork online and manually traced it with Adobe Illustrator to create a vector art version of each part of the image. Then I exported individual parts of the model, such as the body, wrinkles, arms, and so forth. For my previous cookie cutter, I used a website that converts 2D art into 3D models, but this time I decided to try a program called Rhino 3D, which does pretty much the same thing, but with a lot more options. The trial version worked really well, and I considered buying it until I found out that it cost $695. But in any case, the goal here was to create 3D models for each part of Jabba's body. Then I could use Tinkercad to assemble them into one cutter, with different levels for each of the parts. After some testing, I did end up simplifying the model somewhat, getting rid of a lot of the warts and wrinkles and things that were in the original artwork. I also flipped the model horizontally, as you may be able to tell, so that the resulting cookie would look correct. Some parts, like his arms and eyes, I wanted to make recessed so that they would stick out in the resulting cookie. And I'll have to admit, it took several tries to get this right. Here it is printing. Now at first I wanted to make it just a single piece cutter, because I find that more appealing somehow, but I found that it was way too hard to get the dough out of the cutter. So ultimately I went with a two-part design. The inside presses in the details, while the outside, which you can see here, cuts out the cookie. You could also just use the outside if you wanted cookies with a Jabba silhouette, which would be fine if you were planning to frost them. Then I just had to make some dough. Feel free to follow these detailed instructions. There we are. Now it is important to chill the dough before you use it, and also to use plenty of flour on the dough and the cookie cutter to keep it from sticking. Then you just press it into the dough. I would then remove it and switch to the outer cutter. I did also try making a smaller version of the cookie cutter just to see if it would work, but the details didn't really transfer very well, and I figure if you're going to be making a Jabba cookie cutter, you have to make it big. I also put some green tea powder into part of the dough to make green cookies, which seemed appropriate for Jabba. Now I should mention that some of these turned out better than others. As with the Pepperidge Farm cookies, some of them ended up losing a fair amount of their detail when baked, and I'm not entirely sure why. I do think having the dough chilled right up until you bake it helps. And here are some of the finished cookies. Generally speaking, I'm pretty pleased with how these turned out. My only problem now is figuring out where to put all of these Jabba cookies while we're waiting to eat them. But I think I have an idea. In the late 1990s, a company called Star Jars released a line of Star Wars cookie jars. These were quite large and marketed to collectors, so they originally sold for around $250. They released a handful of characters before the line was canceled, including, and I hope you know where I'm going with this, a Jabba the Hutt cookie jar. The sculpt on this is actually pretty cute, but it's let down by the extremely mediocre paint job. It's kind of blotchy and seems to obscure a lot of the detail in the sculpt. They tried to add some detail on the body here, you can see, with paint, but it just doesn't really work very well. Still, this thing is gigantic, and it looks reasonably good from a distance, so it's actually one of my favorite pieces. Plus, there aren't that many of these around. Inside, we have a truly cavernous area for holding cookies. I think you could hold several hundred normal-sized cookies in here. And of course that means there's plenty of room even for my Jabba-sized cookies. If you'd like to try making your own Jabba the Hutt cookies, and why wouldn't you, Both styles of cookie cutter that I made here will be available on Thingiverse for anyone to download freely. The link is in the video description. Now, if you'll excuse me, my family and I have some cookies to eat. Thanks for watching.